The courtroom's gaze. The Cook County Courthouse loomed over the city like a monument to justice, though for many it symbolized something else entirely: power, corruption, and the unchecked authority of those who presided within its walls. The sky outside was a blanket of storm clouds, and rain lashed against the tall, grimy windows, its rhythmic tapping the only sound breaking the courtroom's tension. Inside, the air was thick with whispers and the scent of old wood, a mixture of history and decay. The benches were worn from decades of restless hands gripping them, from anxious families awaiting verdicts, from the countless souls who had passed through these halls seeking fairness and often leaving with disappointment. At the center of it all sat Judge Raymond Calloway, with his silver-streaked hair slicked back, his pristine black robe draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, and his piercing gray-blue eyes surveying the room with quiet authority. He looked the part of a man in control. But control was not something he merely portrayed. It was something he demanded. Calloway's reputation preceded him. He was known for his no-nonsense approach, his strict adherence to the letter of the law, at least when it suited him. Many in the community whispered of his biases, his habit of being harsher on certain defendants, but no one dared challenge him outright. He had been on the bench for over 2 decades, and in that time, no one had ever questioned his rulings without paying the price. The bailiff, a stocky man with a permanent frown, cleared his throat. "Case number 24, CR 3005. He called out. "The State of Illinois versus Naomi Carter." A hush fell over the room. The sound of shuffling papers, the occasional cough, even the rain against the windows seemed to momentarily silence itself as the defendant rose from her seat and walked toward the bench. Naomi Carter. She moved with a quiet confidence, her back straight, her pace unhurried. Though she was in her mid-50s, there was a timelessness about her. Her dark navy dress, modest but well-tailored, hinted at a woman of sophistication. Her neatly styled, silver-streaked hair and the delicate pearl earrings she wore only reinforced the sense that she was not a woman easily intimidated. And yet, despite her presence, despite the weight she seemed to carry in every step, Judge Calloway barely looked at her. He glanced down at the case file in front of him, flipping through the pages with bored detachment. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice low and authoritative, "you stand accused of trespassing and resisting arrest. Do you understand these charges?" A moment of silence. "I understand, Your Honor," Naomi replied, her voice calm. Calloway leaned back slightly in his chair, eyeing her for the first time with mild curiosity. He had seen many defendants in his years, some defiant, some broken, some weeping. But this woman, she was composed, too composed. He smirked. "It says here you refuse to leave a private business after being asked. Do you care to explain why?" Naomi folded her hands in front of her. "I was invited." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the spectators. A woman in the back shook her head, and a man whispered something to his neighbor. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow. "Invited, were you?" "Yes, Your Honor." "By whom exactly?" "A client." More murmurs filled the room. "A client?" The way she said it, so certain, so confident, sent a flicker of annoyance through Calloway. He was used to people stammering in his presence, looking down, pleading for leniency. But this woman, she held his gaze as if she had every right to be standing there. "Ms. Carter," he said, drumming his fingers against the wooden bench, "let me make sure I understand. You're claiming that a well-respected law firm personally invited you to their offices, yet when security asked you to leave, you refused." "That's correct," she said, without hesitation. Judge Calloway exhaled sharply through his nose. "And you resisted arrest." Naomi tilted her head slightly, as if she found the question itself amusing. "If you call questioning an unlawful detainment resisting arrest, then yes." A sharp murmur spread through the room again. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably at their table, and even the bailiff's normally expressionless face twitched. Judge Calloway felt a slow burn of irritation in his chest. This woman was making a mockery of his court. "I see," he said, voice tightening. "And just what kind of client do you represent that would bring you to Langley and Associates?" Naomi didn't blink. "One who is pursuing justice." Calloway nearly laughed. "How quaint. How predictable." "Well, that's very noble, Miss Carter," he said, feigning amusement. "But it seems your pursuit of justice landed you in my courtroom. So let's get to the truth, shall we?" Naomi simply watched him, her expression unreadable. It was unnerving. Judge Calloway tapped his gavel lightly against the bench. "Prosecution, please present your case." The state attorney stood, straightening his tie as he cleared his throat. "Your Honor, on the evening of March 14th, Ms. Carter entered Langley and Associates without authorization. Security personnel informed her that she was not permitted inside, yet she refused to leave. When police arrived, she became uncooperative, forcing officers to physically remove her from the premises." Calloway nodded, satisfied. "Seems straightforward to me." Naomi's defense attorney, Daniel Rice, a young and sharp-eyed lawyer, stood. "Your Honor, my client was not trespassing. She was invited to that office, and we have the evidence to prove it." Calloway barely concealed his smirk. "Oh, this I have to see." Rice approached the bench, a file in hand. "Here is an official email from Langley and Associates confirming Ms. Carter's scheduled appointment. Furthermore, we have security footage showing that one of the firm's senior partners personally greeted her and escorted her inside. The security guards who later called the police did so under false pretenses." The courtroom was deathly silent. Judge Calloway's smirk faded. He snatched the folder from Rice, scanning the documents inside. His jaw clenched as his eyes darted over the official letterhead, the email timestamps, and finally, the security footage screenshots. This was not what he had expected. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Interesting," he muttered. Rice continued, his voice firm. "Not only was Miss Carter there lawfully, but the fact that security guards removed her without verifying her credentials raises serious questions. Why was she singled out? Why was she assumed to be trespassing?" Judge Calloway's grip on his gavel tightened. Naomi Carter watched him, her eyes calm but piercing. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "this case is not just about me. It's about something much bigger." Judge Calloway's pulse quickened. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar creeping in, a sense of unease, and he had a gut feeling that before this trial was over, his entire courtroom was about to be turned against him. The judge's dilemma. The courtroom felt different now. The air was no longer thick with quiet amusement at a defendant's misfortune. No, something had shifted. Whispers spread through the crowd like ripples in water, hushed yet urgent, as if they had collectively realized they were watching something bigger than a simple trespassing case unfold. Judge Calloway, seated high on his bench, forced himself to remain still. His fingers, however, tightened around the gavel in his hand. He had been here before, moments when a case didn't go exactly as expected, when a defendant had the audacity to challenge his authority. But this was different. This woman, Naomi Carter, wasn't just resisting his intimidation. She was calmly tearing down the very premise of the case against her. And worse, her lawyer, Daniel Rice, had just handed over incontrovertible evidence that she had every right to be inside Langley and Associates the night of her arrest. Calloway cleared his throat, buying himself a moment. He skimmed through the email again, willing himself to find something, anything, to discredit it. The document was official, time-stamped, and bore the firm's letterhead. The attached security footage screenshots showed Naomi walking alongside an older white man in an expensive suit, deep in conversation. A senior partner. Calloway's jaw clenched. If this was true, if the firm had indeed invited her in, then this case was nothing more than a fabricated embarrassment. And that did not sit well with him. Across the room, Naomi Carter remained composed, her face unreadable. Unlike most defendants he had encountered, She wasn't sitting rigid with fear, nor did she exude misplaced arrogance. She simply watched him, waiting for him to make his next move. Reyes, her lawyer, took a step forward, his voice steady. "Your Honor, given this evidence, we request an immediate dismissal of all charges." Ms. Carter was legally present in the building. The security guards had no authority to remove her, and the officers who arrested her did so under false pretenses. There is no crime here. Judge Calloway's lips thinned. A dismissal. The thought of it tasted bitter. It would mean admitting he had entertained a baseless case. It would mean acknowledging, in front of a full courtroom, that a black woman who had walked in with her head held high had been wrongfully accused and humiliated. That was something he wasn't prepared to do. Not yet. He shifted in his chair, turning to the prosecution. "Mr. Abbott, does the state have a response?" Assistant District Attorney Greg Abbott, a thin, wiry man whose confidence had noticeably diminished since the start of this hearing, rose slowly. He cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Well, Your Honor," he began hesitantly, "while it is true that we now have evidence suggesting Ms. Carter may have been invited." "She was invited," Reyes interjected firmly. Abbott shot him a quick glare before turning back to the judge. "As I was saying, while there's evidence of an invitation, the fact remains that security asked her to leave. That request should have been honored." Calloway nearly smirked. "That's right, Abbott. Give me something to work with." Reyes didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, security never had the right to remove her in the first place. Are we now suggesting that an invited guest, one with written confirmation, can be forcibly thrown out simply because a security guard assumed she didn't belong there?" A murmur spread through the crowd again. Calloway's grip on the gavel tightened. This was spiraling. Reyes pressed forward. "And let's not ignore the larger issue here. If Ms. Carter had been someone else, if she looked different, would security have treated her the same way? Or is this yet another case of racial profiling?" The words racial profiling hit the courtroom like a hammer. Judge Calloway inhaled sharply, his knuckles whitening. He could feel the eyes on him now, not just from the defendant and her lawyer, but from the spectators, the clerks, even the reporters scribbling hurried notes in the back. This wasn't just about Naomi Carter anymore. It was about him. His court, his judgment, his name. And he was beginning to realize that if he wasn't careful, this case could turn into something far bigger than he had anticipated. He cleared his throat, shifting his attention to Naomi Carter herself. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured, "I'd like to hear from you directly. What exactly brought you to Langley and Associates that evening?" Naomi finally spoke, her voice smooth and unwavering. "I was meeting with a client, Your Honor, someone in need of assistance." "And what kind of assistance do you provide?" She met his gaze evenly. "Legal consultation." A silence stretched between them. Then, a quiet, surprised murmur spread through the room. Reyes smiled slightly. "Your Honor, my client isn't just some random trespasser. She is a highly respected legal consultant specializing in wrongful conviction cases." Judge Calloway's pulse quickened. He had assumed Naomi Carter was just another civilian caught in the legal system, perhaps a teacher, a community activist, or a retiree who had gotten herself into trouble. But now he understood why she carried herself the way she did, why she didn't cower, why she refused to be intimidated. She had knowledge, she had experience, and she had power. Calloway's eyes flicked back down to the file. Suddenly, certain details he had ignored before took on new weight. Naomi Carter's background, her decades of legal advocacy, her work with organizations dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions, her history of taking on cases that often embarrassed the judicial system, cases that embarrassed judges like him. Damn it. He had walked into a trap. And if he wasn't careful, this woman was going to turn his entire courtroom against him. Slowly, Calloway exhaled. He needed time to think, time to regain control. He straightened his posture, tapping the gavel lightly against the wood. Given the new evidence, I'll need to review the details before making any final determinations. Reyes frowned. Your Honor, with all due respect, this case doesn't require further review. The charges should be dropped immediately. Calloway's eyes narrowed. No, that would be too easy. Too humiliating. Mr. Reyes, he said coolly, I decide when a case is ready to be dismissed. Not you. Reyes opened his mouth to argue, but Naomi placed a gentle hand on his arm. She shook her head ever so slightly. Then she turned her gaze back to Calloway. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was stalling, trying to find a way to salvage his own reputation while avoiding the inevitable. She could have pushed back. She could have insisted. But instead, she simply smiled. Not in amusement, not in arrogance, but in quiet certainty. Because Naomi Carter knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. And no matter how hard Judge Calloway tried to control the situation, the truth was already out. And the real fight had just begun. A past that can't be buried. Judge Calloway sat rigid in his chambers, staring at the file on his desk as if it might catch fire. He had excused himself from the courtroom under the pretense of needing to review the new evidence, but the truth was far simpler. He needed time to think. Everything about this case had spiraled out of control. What had started as a routine trespassing charge had transformed into something far more dangerous, a reckoning. And the woman at the center of it, Naomi Carter, wasn't just some defendant trying to avoid consequences. She was a force. Calloway leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He had spent decades on the bench, carving out a reputation as a no-nonsense judge who didn't tolerate nonsense. He prided himself on maintaining order, ensuring that his courtroom ran like a well-oiled machine. But now, that machine was breaking down, and he had no idea how to stop it. A soft knock at the door made him straighten. His clerk, a young man named Brandon, poked his head in. Sir, the prosecution is waiting for your next steps on the Carter case. Calloway exhaled slowly. Tell them I'll be out in 5 minutes. Brandon hesitated. And there's something else. Calloway's stomach tightened. What is it? Brandon stepped fully into the room, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. Then he placed a thin folder on the judge's desk. I took the liberty of running an additional background check on Naomi Carter. Calloway's breath caught. I thought you might want to see this before going back into the courtroom, Brandon added carefully. The judge hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching up the folder. He flipped it open and scanned the first few lines. And then his blood ran cold. His hands clenched involuntarily as he read the words before him. Naomi Carter wasn't just any legal consultant. She was a former law professor, a decorated civil rights attorney. And most unsettling of all, she had once been an assistant district attorney in this very courthouse. The realization struck like a hammer to his chest. That's why she looked familiar. Judge Calloway's grip on the folder tightened as the past he had buried so carefully threatened to claw its way back into the present. 15 years ago. The courtroom had been just as packed as it was today, the heavy wooden benches filled with restless spectators, reporters scribbling notes furiously. But that case had been different. That case had been a scandal. A young black man, Jamal Henderson, had been accused of assaulting a police officer. The evidence was flimsy at best, built on shaky witness testimonies and a conveniently missing body camera recording. The prosecution, led by Richard Calloway, had pushed for the maximum sentence. And the lead defense attorney, Naomi Carter, he could still remember the way she had stood at the center of the courtroom, fearless and unyielding as she dismantled his case piece by piece. She had exposed the inconsistencies in the prosecution's evidence. She had cross-examined officers with a sharpness that had left them floundering. And worst of all, she had made him, Richard Calloway, look like a fool. The jury had acquitted Jamal Henderson after just 2 hours of deliberation. The next morning, newspapers had praised Naomi Carter while criticizing Calloway for his aggressive tactics and failure to prove the case. It was a stain on his record, one he had never forgiven her for. But then, just a few months later, something unexpected had happened. Naomi Carter had vanished. She had quietly stepped down from her legal practice, stopped taking cases, disappeared from the courtroom entirely. Rumors had swirled, burnout, threats, even speculation that she had been forced out, but no one knew for certain. And now, 15 years later, here she was, back in his courtroom. Judge Calloway's stomach churned as he flipped through the rest of the file. Where had she been all these years? What had brought her back to Chicago? And more importantly, was this all just a coincidence? Or had she come back for him? Back in the courtroom, Calloway stepped onto the bench, masking his unease behind his usual cold demeanor. The courtroom quieted as he picked up his gavel, his gaze locking onto Naomi Carter. She was still watching him. And now he knew why. His voice came out steady, betraying none of his internal turmoil. After reviewing the new evidence, I will allow the prosecution additional time to respond. Reyes frowned. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Why delay justice? Calloway met his gaze coolly. The prosecution has the right to a full review. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her lips curling in the faintest trace of a smile. And in that moment, Calloway knew. She remembered. She remembered everything. She knew exactly who he was, exactly what he had done. And yet she wasn't pushing for an immediate win. She was playing the long game. Judge Calloway cleared his throat. This court is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow. As the gavel slammed down, Naomi Carter rose from her seat, adjusting her coat with the same quiet confidence she had displayed since the beginning. She met Calloway's gaze one final time before turning to leave, and in that brief second, a single thought seared through the judge's mind. What does she know? And how much is she planning to expose? Shadows of the past. The courtroom had emptied, but Judge Richard Calloway remained seated on the bench, staring blankly at the polished wood of his desk. His fingers tapped an erratic rhythm against the gavel, a nervous habit he thought he had shed years ago. Naomi Carter was playing with him. That much was obvious. But what was her endgame? He had spent years cultivating his power, securing his position as a force in Chicago's legal system. His reputation was unshakable. And yet, with just a name and a look, Naomi had rattled him in a way no attorney, no prosecutor, no defendant ever had. What was she planning? The door to his chambers creaked open. His clerk, Brandon, entered hesitantly. Sir, you have a visitor. Calloway frowned. I didn't schedule. Before he could finish, Naomi Carter stepped inside. She moved without hesitation, as if she had every right to be there. She removed her gloves, carefully placing them on his desk. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. Brandon glanced between them, clearly sensing the tension. That'll be all, Brandon, Naomi said smoothly, as if she were the one in charge. Brandon hesitated but obeyed, slipping out of the office and shutting the door behind him. The silence stretched. Naomi took a seat across from Calloway, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She studied him, her eyes sharp and unreadable. You always like your chambers cold, she mused. Calloway gritted his teeth. What do you want? Naomi. A slow smile spread across her lips. I was hoping we could have a conversation, she said. Just the two of us. Like old times. 15 years ago. Naomi Carter had always believed in the law. She had fought for it, bled for it, sacrificed everything for the belief that justice was blind. But 15 years ago, she had learned the hardest truth of all. Justice wasn't blind. It was bought. She had been a rising star, a fearless civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. When she had stepped into that courtroom to defend Jamal Henderson, she had thought the truth would be enough. She had exposed the lies. She had humiliated the prosecution, and she had won. But the victory had come at a cost. 1 week after the trial, she had received the first threat. At first, she had brushed it off, An anonymous letter, a veiled warning. But then the calls started. The shadows that lingered outside her apartment window. The break-in that left nothing stolen but her case files. And then, one night, she had come home to find her apartment ransacked, her walls defaced with red paint. And scrawled across her living room wall, in thick, dripping letters, Leave, or you duduo and tgeta and chance. She had gone to the police. They had done nothing. She had gone to her colleagues. They had warned her to back off. And then Richard Calloway, then a powerful prosecutor, soon to be a judge, had pulled her aside in the courthouse hallway. "I told you to stop pushing," he had said in a low, casual voice. "You made the wrong enemies, Naomi. This city doesn't forget." She had stared at him, searching for even a flicker of regret in his face. She had found none. That night, she had packed her bags and disappeared, back to the present. Now, 15 years later, Naomi sat across from Judge Calloway, her expression unreadable. Calloway exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. "You've made your point. You're back. You've had your little moment in court. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Naomi tilted her head. "Do you really not know? I don't have time for games." Her smile faded. "Neither do I." She leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. "I left Calloway. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Because people like you made sure I had no other choice." He flinched. Naomi studied him for a long moment. "But the thing about the past," she continued, "it doesn't stay buried forever." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She slid it across the desk toward him. Calloway hesitated, then opened it. His pulse spiked. Inside were documents, transcripts, old reports. Some he recognized, some he didn't, and that was the part that scared him. "These files were erased," he said before he could stop himself. Naomi's expression didn't change. "You thought they were," she said. "But you underestimated how many people wanted to see the truth come to light." Calloway's mind raced. This was bigger than a personal vendetta. This wasn't just about Naomi Carter coming back to embarrass him. She had evidence. She had names. And worst of all, she had power. Calloway clenched his jaw. "If you think you can bring me down." Naomi leaned forward, her voice dangerously calm. "Oh, Richard," she murmured, "I'm not just bringing you down. I'm bringing them all down." Silence. Calloway's grip tightened on the folder. Naomi rose from her chair, slipping her gloves back on. "I suggest you get some rest, Judge," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a very long day." She turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before exiting. "Oh, and one more thing," she added over her shoulder. She glanced back at him, her eyes filled with something Calloway had never seen before. "Pity. I'm not the scared young lawyer you pushed out of this courthouse," she said. "You don't hold the power anymore." And then she was gone. Judge Calloway sat frozen, staring at the door long after it had closed. For the first time in his career, he was afraid. The reckoning begins. The morning after, Judge Richard Calloway hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night pacing his office, the folder Naomi Carter had given him spread across his desk like a crime scene. The documents inside weren't just dangerous. They were explosive. They detailed years of corruption, bribes, manipulated verdicts, coerced confessions. Names were listed. Powerful names. People who had built their careers on backdoor deals and silenced victims. And his name was all over it. Calloway's mind raced. How the hell did she get these? The records had been wiped. The people involved had gone to great lengths to ensure nothing remained. But somehow, Naomi had dug them up. She had proof. She had leverage. And she wasn't alone. Someone had helped her. Someone with access. Someone who wanted to see him fall. A sharp knock at his door made him flinch. Brandon, his ever-loyal clerk, stepped inside. His face was pale, his hands clutching a stack of newspapers. "You need to see this," Brandon said, setting the papers on the desk. Calloway snatched the top one. His stomach twisted. There, splashed across the front page, was a photo of Naomi Carter, her expression calm, poised, and unshaken. And beneath it, the headline, "Quruption XPOZ Chicago GDG AMMPLICATED in decade old COV." The article laid it all out. Cases tampered with, sentences altered, lives ruined, and at the center of it all, Judge Richard Calloway. His chest tightened. This wasn't just a scandal. This was a career-ending, reputation-destroying catastrophe. The phone on his desk buzzed violently, and he grabbed it. The voice on the other end was furious. "Calloway, what the hell is happening?" It was James Holloway, the state's district attorney and one of his biggest political allies. I don't know," Calloway stammered, still staring at the newspaper. "You don't know?" Holloway seethed. "My office is getting calls from reporters, defense attorneys, and half the damn courthouse. They're reopening cases, Calloway. Every single case you touched." Calloway's mouth went dry. Reopening cases meant one thing. Every person he had wrongfully sentenced, every shady conviction, every corrupt ruling would come back to haunt him. "Fix this," Holloway ordered. "Now." Click. The line went dead. Calloway slammed the phone down, his mind racing. Meanwhile, Naomi Carter stood outside the courthouse steps, watching the chaos unfold. She had arrived early that morning, knowing exactly what would happen once the article hit the press. Reporters swarmed the entrance. Lawyers whispered in hushed, frantic voices. There was an electric tension in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. And at the center of it all was her. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "It's done," she said simply. On the other end, a deep chuckle rumbled. "I knew you'd pull it off." Naomi allowed herself a small smile. "We're just getting started." She hung up and stepped inside the courthouse. The moment she walked through the doors, all eyes turned to her. Some were curious, some were nervous, and some were downright terrified. Naomi walked with purpose, moving past the murmuring attorneys and stunned clerks. She had been forced to leave once, but she was back now, and she wasn't leaving until justice was served. Judge Calloway's last stand. Back in his office, Calloway's hands trembled as he stuffed documents into a briefcase. He needed an escape plan. He could still get ahead of this. Maybe a deal, maybe favors from powerful allies, or maybe he just needed to disappear. His thoughts were interrupted by another knock. This one was louder, heavier, final. Before he could respond, the door swung open, and 2 federal agents stepped inside. "Judge Calloway," one of them said, flashing a badge. "You're coming with us." The room spun. This wasn't an interrogation. This wasn't a warning. This was an arrest. He was done. As they placed the cuffs around his wrists, his gaze flickered to the window. Outside, he could see Naomi Carter standing at the courthouse steps, watching as they led him away. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her eyes said it all. Justice had finally arrived. The fall of the mighty. A city in turmoil. The news of Judge Calloway's arrest sent shockwaves throughout Chicago. Every major news outlet picked up the story. Courtrooms, police stations, and law offices were buzzing with one question. Who else was involved? Naomi Carter stood at the courthouse steps, watching as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. This wasn't over. Judge Calloway had been the first domino, but there were more to fall. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. A single text message flashed across her screen. "It's time." She tucked her phone away and walked inside. Her fight wasn't finished. The Council of Corruption. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit, smoke-filled room, a secret meeting was taking place. 5 men and 1 woman sat around a polished mahogany table. State officials, prosecutors, and wealthy benefactors. Their faces were tight with anxiety. One man, James Holloway, the district attorney, slammed his fist on the table. "This is spiraling out of control. We should have handled her earlier," another official muttered. "Now she's bringing everything into the light." "Calloway was a fool," said a third, shaking his head. "He got sloppy. We should have." Enough. The room fell silent. The only woman at the table, Eleanor Brooks, the Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, leaned forward. Her icy gaze swept across the room. "This isn't just about Calloway," she said. "Naomi Carter has documents. She has proof. And she has the city's attention." She let the words settle before delivering her final verdict. "She needs to be dealt with." The room nodded in agreement. A phone rang. One of the men answered, listened for a few moments, then looked up. "She's here." Naomi walks into the lion's den. Naomi Carter strode into the private chamber, unshaken. She knew they'd be waiting for her. Knew they'd try to intimidate her. But what they didn't know was that she had already won. James Holloway smirked. "Miss Carter, this isn't unexpected." "Spare me the performance," she cut him off, placing a thick black folder on the table. The official stiffened. "What's this?" Eleanor Brooks asked coolly. Naomi leaned forward. "Evidence." She flipped the folder open, revealing pages of sealed court records, wire transfers, internal emails, and testimonies from whistleblowers. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but the other men shifted uncomfortably. Naomi let the silence hang before speaking again. "This is just a fraction of what I have. Enough to bring down every single person at this table." James Holloway forced a chuckle. "Now, Miss Carter, I think you should listen." Naomi interrupted. She picked up her phone and pressed a button. A second later, a live video feed appeared on a large screen in the room. A press conference was in progress. At the podium stood one of their own, a former prosecutor, and he was confessing everything. Naomi saw panic flicker across their faces. She smiled. "I gave the press everything," she said. "This is going live in every major news outlet as we speak." Eleanor's face darkened. Naomi looked her dead in the eye. "You're finished." The fall of the corrupt. Within hours, the scandal exploded. Investigations were launched. High-ranking officials resigned. Indictments were handed down. Eleanor Brooks was arrested. James Holloway vanished overnight. The others scrambled to make deals, but the system they had built was now devouring them whole. And at the center of it all, Naomi Carter stood victorious. She didn't do this for revenge. She did it for every wrongfully convicted person, every silenced victim, every life ruined by a corrupt system. And she wasn't done yet. As she left the courthouse for the last time, a young black woman stopped her on the steps. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice trembling, "because of you, my brother is getting a new trial." Naomi smiled. Then it was all worth it. She turned and walked into the city, ready for the next battle. Because justice wasn't a moment, it was a mission.